It says it's showtime. How is the audio? Everything sound okay? Anybody out there to tell me if it sound is okay? How is it? How are we doing for sound? This is the inaugural episode for season 6 of our podcast, Journey of an Aesthete podcast, and this is season 6. We're beginning with something a little bit unusual, even for me or us. In other words, I'm trying to create a type of performance right now. I'm doing it right now. I'm talking about it right now, in which I intersperse performance of music with something in between an old lecture, storytelling. We'll see. It's kind of some kind of unusual mixture that I'm trying to concoct here on the fly, spontaneously. So in 2013, I created a style of solo piano music to be all composed by me. And there's a long, multi-decade story behind that decision. So I'm going to start, I said I was going to call this hard listening, and the first, this was a digital, physical recording release, and I tried to copy the old, some of the old effects of a record, And then after this, in 2016, I did volume 2 of hard listening, and yes, hard listening is a joke about easy listening music. So these are categories. So I don't know how far back I want to go. So I think in 1980s. So let me go back to 1977. So in 1977, I was listening to large albums and records, and I was very taken with all kinds of music. And so I discovered, Herbie Hancock, and he's not the only person I discovered at that time, and you could say he was among the most important that I discovered. He certainly was central, at least for that time and today. Because I was also discovering some other things. But what my reason in bringing this up is that I got this album, Chameleon album, this Headhunters album, okay, which was a platinum selling album in 1970, was it 75, 74, I think, yeah, 74. And I had that album in 74, so I would have been, do the math here, yeah, I was like 7, 8 years old, listening to this kind of music. I was also listening at the same time to some, what we would now call straight ahead mainstream African American jazz music. In fact, jazz is a fundamental sort of foundation for my hard listening approach to solo piano, but it's not the only one, which we'll get to soon. So I was really taken with this funky music of this band. And it's interesting because I think I started, at that time I was very, when you study piano, as I did then, especially 60s, 70s, early 80s, it's almost, piano becomes synonymous with classical music. It becomes synonymous with Mozart, Bach, Prelude and Fugue, Well-Tempered Clavier, right? Chopin, Mazurka, Polonaise, this kind of, music from the 18th and 19th centuries and a little bit the 20th century. That's kind of what you do at that time. Again, I can't speak for now because I'm not a parent, thankfully, and I'm not a grandparent. So I don't know, maybe it's the same, maybe it's different, I don't know. But that's kind of, you studied piano. I had an Italian piano teacher, and so you whatever else you're interested in, whatever else you're doing in music, if you're playing piano, you get funneled into that. And I'm sure it's the same for certain other kinds of instruments. I don't know. Maybe if you're, I think if you're an oboist, you know, or a bassoonist or a viola or violin, you get channeled into that European concert music. That's a way to describe it. You know, even though people doing that might be interested in doing something else, you know. But I was always interested in doing something else, but, you know, I got channeled, and I had a really great Italian piano teacher. And so working, audition, learning music, ended up in Boston in the 80s. And so I can't begin to paint for you adequately now with full justice and full articulation the feeling of arriving in one of the great biggest cities in these United States in the middle 1980s, in what you would call I would call it the cultural revolution of, I guess, the Wynton Marsalis movement. I mean, I don't want to necessarily put one name to it, but that he was prominent in that. And I remember I was at, so I went to Interlochen Arts Academy, and we were sitting in, and we had like a community television. This is the very thing, you know, that also 70s and 80s community TVs. And I remember seeing at the Grammy, watching Marsalis' band play, you know, Smoking and Kenny Kirkland on piano. And I'd already was going to that high school and playing in the big band. So I was wanting to become a jazz musician. And so, you know, but when you're in, when you're in the midst of a revolution that you didn't know was a revolution, and most people, so categories are very important. Now, a lot of people at NEC, as we called it, did not like this revolution. They would call it a counter-revolution. They would call it conservative. They would call it traditionalist, neo-traditionalist, because it was not avant-garde. And it was, but when I was watching this Marsalis group, and I went on to see them, by the way, at 14 at the Village Vanguard, probably 83, live, you know, right here, not far from where I am, where you could see me there. That's where Marsalis' band was, Bradford. And, you know, around the same time period, I saw Sarah Vaughan there and some other people. Where am I going with this? So when I listened to this No Smoking, this great tune, I said to myself, well, that sounds like Miles Davis in the 60s. Exactly. I'm saying that's kind of like the way they're playing, like Ron Carter and Tony Williams, and Kenny Kirkland was a little bit like Herbie Hancock when he's not playing electronically, right? I thought that was really interesting. Now, that was my first, it was very exciting to hear this. I liked it. And I was involved in bands, and so I was playing that way. In other words, so at that time, because this was what do you call it, the milieu, it was about certain kinds of pianists. So I'm going to throw some names out there. People like Bud Powell, Sonny Clark, Tommy Flanagan, Hank Jones. I loved Hank Jones. Acoustic kind of folks, you know, and then some of the modern people. And, you know, I remember once I was at a rehearsal and a dude came up to me and said, "Hey, Mitch, somebody told me you sounded like Wynton Kelly." And it was not a compliment, by the way, because the guy that was accusing me of sounding like Wynton Kelly would much have preferred that I sound and played like Cecil Taylor or Andrew Hill. He would have been much more happy with that the case. And so I think, well, people want to label things. I took a class. I took so many interesting classes. I took a class in musical history, I think, and there was a dude with really, his hair down to here and Birkenstocks, like many of the professors did at NEC in 1984, the mid-80s. It was just the thing. Birkenstocks, tie-dyed shirts. I actually like people Shane's age today, maybe a little bit. Interesting. Fashions, you know, it's funny to think about that. That would have been the fashion for a professor would be the same fashion as someone now 22. It's a little, to be a little strange, because typically things change, or maybe they don't. I don't know. Anyhow, he played a example. He says, I'm going to play you a piece of music. He played a piece of music. And I think it was Tchaikovsky, Swan Lake, I think, right? And I was listening to it, this piece of music. And the professor says, now, what did you think about that music? And then he began to inform us that it was Moog synthesizers. That it was a synthetic sort of AI at that time, whatever AI would have been in 1986. An AI-informed reconstruction of Tchaikovsky's work. And it fooled some of the kids. Like, some of the people thought it was a real orchestra, and he says, it's sort of like, this the magic trick is that these are synthesizers. And this is all going on, and I'm playing in this great acoustic bands. One of the best bands was with Dimitri Matheny, really, really just playing really these great arrangements, and it was a lot of music. The name that comes to mind above all is Art Blakey. Blue Note, that sound, it's the sound of the 50s and early 60s, mid-60s. Now, I'm doing all this. I meet Professor Stanley Cowell, back there. I have a record back there of him. He had been playing with the Heath brothers and some other people, Jimmy Heath and Percy Heath and Albert Tootie Heath. And his perspective is, he says, Mitch, if you are a pianist, everything you do in this music must start from solo piano. You have to be able to play every part of the music completely and totally self-sufficient. He said, if you're going to be part of a rhythm section, all you do, if you have all of that foundation, the bass, the harmony, the melody, all you do is, if you're part of a rhythm section, you just take things out. You don't play certain things. But you have to know it. Sort of the principle is that you're actually learning the full song, the full structure. I did this with him. So I consider my experience with Stanley Cowell, I consider that not contemporary music instruction. If we're looking at this in terms of periodization, contemporary music instruction is the college system or the conservatory system. Even though this was in the context of a school, this was the apprentice system. And the apprentice system, I was one of the last people to do this apprentice system. You study at the feet of a master, of somebody who's really, really great. In the case of Stanley Cowell, really great. I mean, Stanley Cowell grew up with Art Tatum being a family friend and coming over and playing their family piano. And, imagine a 8-year-old Stanley Cowell with the story about Stanley Cowell's mom had to leave the living room and escape to the kitchen because his piano, Art Tatum's piano, was so riveting and overwhelming, in the sense that sometimes great art can be overwhelming and sort of awesome in the proper use of the word, as we used it then. So Stanley Cowell got me interested, the germ or the seed of what would it be like to really do a solo piano project. But I never pursued it really, because solo piano is often relegated to cocktail or background music, unfortunately. Now this is what's really interesting. I had this whole detour in the 90s, and I was writing sonatas and symphonies and piano concertos, and writing a lot for sopranos and tenors and baritones, and choral music and kind of sort of classical contemporary instrumental music. And I did that for 12, 13, 14 years. And I learned an enormous amount doing that, traveled the world. But all the while I'm doing that, I felt I was getting away too much from my roots in what we would call, or many would call, jazz music, or forms of it. And so, end up in the 2000s, and my father had just died in 2011. I was also thinking, for some reason it occurred to me, I thought, well, maybe if I create a kind of a music, so what would it be like to create a music that I would compose and improvise, and I would have titles, right? But all, I would call it the raw material of this music would be the most, and I'm trying to find the right words, the most common, possibly cliched, language of American popular commercial studio music, by which I mean specifically things like Henry Mancini, Hollywood, film music, but of a certain kind, not Carter Burwell, not that kind of film music. I mean, what I mean is, and not, again, it's complicated. I'm not Waxman from the 40s, not that, but kind of the sound, I would say, if we had to put years around it, probably the sound of 1966 through 1986. Let's have that be a chunk of time. A lot of stuff happened in those years. And so also in the way that a classical composer like a Bartók would use Hungarian folk music, I would use pop folk music, or use the hit parade, or these figures, and combine it with some of these more sophisticated things from African American music and the jazz, and see what I come up with, and also write these pieces, and finally make it a kind of an art music, by which I mean music that you would play in a recital hall at a piano, very much like this 1979 Steinway that sits here before you now. And so everything I've done since 2013, more or less, is in the hard listening style, which I call it hard listening. So that even it's kind of a little bit based on, I mean, there's one piece I did that sounded like Little Green Apples by Glenn Campbell. I mean, it's not totally stolen. There's a little bit of that in there, and some of this kind of really, things from other eras. And also wanted to combine these musical styles in such a way that there's a proximity in time, temporal proximity of period to period or era to era. And again, I'm very influenced by, sometimes in a negative way, influenced by what people say. I had a professor that said, when you write a piece of music, you must never change styles, ever. You must, the beginning of the piece of music must be in the same style as the end of the piece of music, whatever it is. That was his belief. I've spent 35 years of my life violating his principle. So that, I have a piece of music and I, sometimes a little bit more restrained in this regard, where you could be in 1930 and then what would it be like to go from 1930 to 1970 in a way that's not too jarring. And I'm still experimenting with that. That's kind of where it stands now. Hard listening. So I'm going to take this drink of coffee here. So go back to NEC. So in NEC, I did a report for an American music class, and I chose for American music, the Headhunters album. And I did this long discussion of Chameleon by that band. And think about this, I was doing this in 1986. So this is long before all the subsequent musicology and discussion of African music, and there's been enormous literature, especially in the 90s, especially in the early 2000s. This book I just showed you, it's, was it Steve? Yeah, Stephen Pond's book, and all this stuff hadn't really been done. Even though that Herbie's band was largely inspired by the great Bill Summers and others, who themselves were experts and musicologists as well as percussionists to this day. but that's, it has, and so this was like, it was a really strange thing to do. So the professor really, really did not like my presentation. I think I got a C plus on that. I think it's one of the few C pluses or B minuses I got at that school. And I did this presentation. I said, well, look at how Herbie moves these chords and how there's this funk groove. And the professor said, Mitch, you haven't answered the fundamental question about this piece of music, which is this music a sellout commercial pop piece, or is it better than that? So in other words, he was basically giving me a lower grade because I didn't even talk about it in those terms. Because I'm not or wasn't interested in that. I still am not. I mean, those terms are there. It was a platinum selling album. So clearly young people love this album. So it was commercially successful. But I went to all these things about all these different chords. I says, it goes like here. It goes, this is like Ravel. And Herbie was into Ravel. And this is like Sly Stone. I like all this thing. And all the professor wanted to do was say, he wanted to morally evaluate it as an object in the world. Just actually, he's a forerunner of everything today. We only morally evaluate things. We don't aesthetically evaluate them, and we don't actually get inside of what they actually are. And so he was like, Mitch, is this a sellout? And I couldn't believe. I'm like, well, what are you talking? So what are you talking about? And so that's a little bit that experience in that class is behind hard listening, of course, as is Stanley Cow. I mean, most of the experiences were quite positive. I mean, I should say the experience of studying with George Russell and hearing George Russell talk about working with John Coltrane and Bill Evans for hours on end. He would go on and on. Train would do this and use this reed, and when we did this recording, and I was just sitting there listening to all this. And that's just, that's it. That's the apprentice system. That's the thing, right? So I think. So maybe I've talked for too long, but I did want to just give a little background of why hard listening. There's a little bit of humor in the category, of course. Now, Amazon, if you buy volume 2, which is my favorite of the two, I like it better. There's a version of Cole Porter that's like 17 minutes long that I'm very proud of, if I may say so. I mean, I'm proud of it. That opens up volume 2, says that album is explicit, has explicit content. Because the word hard is in it, I guess. Right? It's got a, right? I guess that it's like, hard, different and more juvenile definition of hard, being hard, right? And so it's on there, even though there's no lyrics. So this is the thing about computers and the internet, it has a mind of its own. So today's piece I'm going to play is based on a piano quintet. So originally it was written for a string quartet and me, improvising and playing. Thus far, I have not found a string quartet to do it. I've been putting it out there. I thought, well, what would happen if I took the score and let's see here. This is the score, right? Chicken scratch, right? What would happen if I took the score and made it for solo piano? Made it into hard listening. Sort of hard listening volume 3. And so that's what I did. I took this and you can call it a reduction or an arrangement. That's what I did. And so I'm not going to digitize, I'm not going to do a digital score of this until I find a proper string quartet for it somewhere to do it. And so maybe that's one of the stages. So this is kind of the piano, solo piano form. I don't want to talk a lot about, I'll talk a little bit about influences. So Aaron Copland, a little bit, for some reason. I don't know why. I do like Copland, but there's many other people. It's 2 movements. And so I have titles here. One title, the title of movement one is called A City Slicker Stuck in the Country. It's a portrait of a person. A city slicker stuck in the country is what it's called. And movement two is called Boogie. That's all it's called. Now I had different other titles. I think Boogie is the it's the what the title is now. So I think it's kind of fun. So I'm gonna go perform my piano quintet or dot or solo piano. All right. It's movement one. All right. Where did that go? Oh. It's movement 2. I got to change some paper over here. Huh. Hmm. Well, that's the piece. This is my first time playing it in public. It's partly improvised, of course, and I took some liberties with it. So I sincerely hope you got something out of that. Is that a wrap, or should we talk some more? Or? I don't know. It's 8 p.m., so that's an hour. That's piano quintet. City Slicker, Stuck in the Country, and Boogie. So have a great weekend, everybody, and please join our podcast and subscribe if you can, and be part of season 6, because there's a lot of treats in store for you coming up. So thank you.